The United Nations headquarters in New York was a city within a city that morning. The great marble towers of the complex glistened, under a sky washed in late autumn light, the Hudson River catching reflections of steel and glass as if it too were listening. Motorcades had begun arriving before dawn, sweeping through cordoned streets where NYPD barricades and UN security checkpoints funneled the world's power into one location. Diplomats, aides, and press officers hurried through the plaza, beneath the flags of nearly 200 nations, each banner rippling in the cold wind as if it carried its own whisper of rivalry and history. Inside the building, the atmosphere was heavier still. The corridors of the UN were familiar to anyone who had spent years in diplomacy, but today they carried a different weight. It wasn't just another summit on global stability. This gathering had the feel of a turning point, a moment in which speeches would not only be delivered but replayed endlessly, paused for signals, and remembered in textbooks years later. One of the marble-lined conference rooms, reserved for high-level leaders, was already filling. The air smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and anticipation. The lighting was cold, fluorescent beams bouncing off white walls, making every expression visible, every twitch of impatience impossible to hide. At the head of the table stood Caroline Leavitt, a young and outspoken figure in American politics, whose rapid rise had made her both admired and feared. She wore a sharply tailored navy suit that seemed chosen as much for the cameras as for the occasion. Arms crossed, chin lifted, her eyes swept across the room, with the confidence of someone who had been told all. Her life that she belonged at the center of decisions. Across from her sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the military officer turned president of Burkina Faso. His uniform was immaculate, pressed fabric, polished insignia, cap resting neatly beside him. Yet it was not the clothes that commanded attention, it was his composure. Where others shifted in their chairs or flipped through briefing papers, he sat still, watchful, as if the room itself were a battlefield and patience the first weapon. The two had never met in person before, but their reputations had preceded them. Caroline, the ambitious voice of a global order built on Western alliances. Traoré, the fiery advocate of sovereignty, who had electrified Africa with speeches about dignity and independence. The buzz of side conversations dimmed when Caroline leaned forward, her voice cutting the air cleanly. "Captain Ibrahim," she said, deliberately dispensing with his presidential title. "Your speeches have been making waves, talking about sovereignty, about rejecting foreign influence." A faint smirk curved her lips. "Let's be clear. We decide who leads in the world, and we've decided you should take a backseat." A few of her advisors stirred uncomfortably. It wasn't the language usually heard in a diplomatic forum. Yet Caroline had calculated the effect, to project dominance, to rattle him before the real agenda began. But Traoré did not flinch. He leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the polished table, his voice calm but carrying. "You decide who leads," he repeated, almost conversationally. "But the people already have." The words dropped like stones in water. Silence rippled outward. Caroline's smirk stayed, but her eyes narrowed. "Your people may have chosen you," she said smoothly. "But global leadership is about more than a local vote. It's about alignment, cooperation, playing by the rules." She let the pause hang before adding, "Our rules." A faint smile touched his lips. "I wasn't elected to play by your rules, Ms. Leavitt. I was elected to defend my people from those who think they own the game." The tension thickened palpably. The American delegation exchanged hurried whispers. The African representatives sat still, their silence itself a form of approval. Caroline tapped her fingers lightly on the lacquered wood, a metronome of decision. She chose escalation. "You think your words will shield you," she said, her tone edged with steel. "But influence isn't about speeches. It's about power. And we have more of it than you could ever imagine." Traoré straightened slowly in his chair, meeting her gaze with steady calm. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "you've never imagined the power of a people who refuse to be ruled by fear." The silence that followed was electric. Journalists at the edge of the room shifted, cameras angling like predators toward sound. Everyone knew this exchange would travel far beyond the marble walls. The moderator cleared his throat nervously. attempting to steer the dialogue towards safer ground. But the duel had begun, and neither side was prepared to yield. Caroline leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to sound confidential but sharp enough to cut. Let's be honest, Captain. Leadership isn't a feeling. It's consensus. Networks. Access. We built the rooms. Where decisions are made. Without blinking, he replied, and we built the houses those rooms sit in. The people outside your doors are still people. They chose me. She arched a brow. Chose you, or cheered you. There's a difference. Real leadership is when other nations point to you and say, we trust that one. He let the sentence breathe, then answered, Granite steady. Real leadership is when your own people look into a mirror and say, we recognize ourselves in that one. The delegations rippled, some smirks, some frozen pens. The moderator shifted nervously, sensing control slipping like sand through fingers. Caroline pressed again. You talk about sovereignty as if it's a shield against reality. Supply chains, security, capital, those are realities. You can't opt out. Opting out is not the point, Traoré replied. Owning in is. We'll trade, we'll partner, but not as tenants in houses we don't own. Her smile thinned. Tenants, we invited you in. And send us the bill, he countered, deadpan. A few stifled laughs broke from the African bloc. On the American side, jaws tightened. If you refuse the framework, Caroline warned, you'll learn what isolation feels like. Isolation, Traoré said evenly, is eating from a table where the host demands. You forget who brought the harvest. This time the silence was thick enough to cut. Caroline tapped once on the table. You play a romantic story well, Captain. But when pressure comes, markets move. Borders strain. You will need the rooms we built. Then we will build ours, he answered, voice firm. And fill them with those you left waiting in the hall. For a moment, the entire room tilted. The moderator's gavel struck, suggesting a break. But no one moved immediately. What had begun as posture had crystallized into principle. And principle echoed louder than microphones. Caroline's gaze locked with his. We decide who leads, she repeated slowly, as if chiseling it into marble. The people already have, he returned. Not louder but closer, and somehow the echo reached further than both of them. The recess was supposed to last 10 minutes. Instead, it spilled into corridors heavy with whispers, footsteps, and strategy. Caroline moved briskly, her aides forming a protective wall around her, as they whispered like chess masters, mapping the next 10 moves. Traoré walked alone at first, hands clasped behind his back, the picture of calm until a young delegate from Namibia fell into step beside him. You're rattling them, the delegate murmured. Careful, they'll try to box you in with procedures. Traoré smiled faintly. Procedures are just walls with doors they keep locked. We'll find another way in, or build around them. At the far end of the hall, a US trade advisor intercepted Caroline, sliding a tablet into her hands. We can push for a rule change on the voting structure, he whispered. Make his bloc need a 2/3 majority to pass resolutions. That'll freeze him. Caroline's eyes flicked across the corridor, where Traoré was now surrounded by West African ministers. She nodded sharply. Do it quietly. If he thinks we are playing hardball, he'll turn it into a story about colonial tactics. We keep this technical. Back in the main chamber, the moderator introduced an unscheduled agenda item, resource cooperation frameworks. It was a surgical insertion, definitions, that could tilt the entire summit's balance. Caroline returned to her seat with the faintest curl of satisfaction. But Traoré had anticipated it. As soon as the floor opened, he stood. Before we discuss resources, he said, voice ringing clear, we must decide who defines cooperation. Too often, the word means one side extracts while the other side applauds. That is not cooperation. That is choreography. Murmurs swept the room. Caroline leaned toward her MIC. And yet without choreography, Captain, everyone collides. You need a conductor. His gaze met hers. The people are the music. We conduct ourselves. For a heartbeat, it was just the two of them, two figures in a room of nations, testing who would set the tempo of the future. The gavel struck again, but the rhythm had already shifted. The late afternoon sun slanted across the facade of the Capitol dome, casting long shadows over the mall as the Senate chamber prepared itself for a session that would carry far more weight than the procedural language in its docket suggested. Reporters crowded outside like a restless tide, their microphones catching fragments of rumor, none of them fully aware that the name Traoré was about to become a refrain echoing through Washington's corridors. Inside, Caroline Leavitt walked with the air of someone who understood both the fragility and ferocity of power. Her tailored navy suit clung to her like armor, and her expression carried that familiar blend of defiance and calculation that had made her a figure people either dismissed as too young or feared as too unyielding. Today she felt the latter was true. She was not just a freshman representative fighting for airtime. She was now the axis around which an unexpected storm swirled. Traoré's presence in the United States had not been widely announced, but it had been deeply felt. His speech before a private gathering of African diaspora leaders the previous evening had ricocheted through encrypted channels, activist networks, and, inevitably, into the ears of certain congressional staffers, who whispered of his blunt condemnations. Africa does not exist to be your laboratory, nor your chessboard. Leavitt had listened to the grainy recording in her office, headphones pressed tight, eyes narrowing at the cadence of a man who carried the battlefield into his rhetoric. She understood the danger, not of him as an individual, but of the narrative he represented. The American machine thrived on stability, on keeping foreign dissent compartmentalized, academic, sterilized. Traoré was none of those things. He was raw. He was loud. He was uncontrollable. When she entered the chamber, the usual gallery of aides and lobbyists craned their necks, sensing that something unusual was afoot. Leavitt took her seat but did not immediately engage in the perfunctory small talk. Her mind was elsewhere, on the upcoming closed-door briefing where intelligence officials would present their assessment of Traoré's visit. The briefing room later that evening was dimly lit, its oval table scattered with thick folders stamped classified. At the far end, a man from the CIA clicked through slides that depicted satellite images of Burkina Faso, maps of troop movements, and intercepts of communications, suggesting coordinated rhetoric against Western corporations. He is not just a populist, the analyst said in clipped tones. He is attempting to formalize a network. Think Pan-Africanism with teeth, with resources, with alliances. Leavitt interjected. And yet he walks into our capital city without consequence. Why? The room quieted. The official hesitated before replying. Because arresting him risks amplifying his narrative. He is not a fugitive. He is a head of state. Our calculus is complicated. Leavitt leaned back, lips pressed into a thin line. She recognized the pattern. Washington's hesitancy was always couched in strategy, but underneath it lay fear of headlines. Spiraling out the grand halls of Washington had always been a stage for power plays, but never before had they borne witness to the kind of tectonic clash that now loomed. By the time the third week of this simmering crisis arrived, the United States was no longer dealing with whispers in corridors or the feverish speculation of think tanks. It was confronting an unavoidable reckoning, and at the center of it stood Caroline Leavitt, her jaw set in a defiant line, her name invoked in every headline, every cable news alert, every whispered aside in the corridors of power. Across the Atlantic, in Ouagadougou, the air vibrated with a very different kind of energy. Ibrahim Traoré had become more than a leader. He was a symbol. To millions of Africans, he embodied defiance against a global order that had long extracted wealth without reciprocity, dictated policies without accountability, and cloaked exploitation in the language of aid. Traoré's speeches were now replayed in markets, in universities, even in remote villages where electricity was a luxury but satellite radio carried his voice like a drumbeat of liberation. Leavitt knew she was racing against time. The narrative was slipping away from her, despite her carefully orchestrated press conferences and her well-oiled machinery of spin. Each attempt to paint Traoré as unstable, as dangerous, was met with viral rebuttals that traveled faster than any carefully curated talking point. Independent journalists, student groups, African diasporas in Paris and New York. They were all flooding the digital sphere with counter-messages. In the West Wing, Caroline convened what her staff called the War Room. Screens glowed with maps of Africa, live feeds of protests in European capitals, and draft speeches waiting for her approval. Advisors debated furiously, some urging a more conciliatory tone, others pressing for sanctions that could cripple Burkina Faso's fragile economy. Caroline slammed her hand against the table. Sanctions won't work. They'll make him a martyr, she snapped, her voice slicing through the room. What we need is division. We need to fracture his support before it consolidates into something unstoppable. An advisor cleared his throat nervously. Madam Speaker, Traoré is already coordinating with Mali, Niger, and even whispers from Guinea. If this bloc solidifies, then it's no longer about one man, Caroline finished coldly. It becomes a movement, and movements are far harder to kill than men. That line lingered in the room. Movements are harder to kill. It was the unspoken fear gnawing at Washington, Paris, Brussels. For decades, the global order had relied on keeping nations isolated, divided by language, by borders drawn with colonial pens, by economic dependence. Traoré was unraveling that strategy with nothing more than conviction, courage, and a gift for rhetoric that could stir both anger and hope. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré prepared his most audacious move yet. He called for an extraordinary summit, not just of Sahel states, but of intellectuals, artists, union leaders, and grassroots organizers from across the continent. His advisors cautioned him. This will be seen as a direct challenge, Ibrahim. They will not let it go unanswered. Traoré's eyes burned with a quiet intensity. Good, he said simply. Then let them answer. For too long, we have spoken softly and begged politely. Now, we will speak loudly, and we will not ask. We will demand. The day of the summit, Ouagadougou's streets swelled with humanity. Banners draped across buildings bore slogans of unity. Women carried calabashes of water as a symbol of life shared. Men beat drums that echoed like the heartbeat of a rising continent. Delegates arrived in caravans, not in the sleek black sedans of Western summits, but in buses and trucks, greeted by crowds that pressed close, reaching out as if to touch history in the making. When Traoré took the stage, silence fell. His uniform was simple, his tone unadorned, but every word struck with the force of a hammer. They say we are weak, he began, his voice carrying across the open-air stadium. They say we must bow our heads, accept the terms written for us, because we are too poor, too divided, too unprepared. But look around you. Do you see weakness? The crowd roared back, a thunder that rolled into the distance. No, Traoré continued, his fist raised. What I see is strength. What I see is unity. What I see is the end of their lies. Caroline Leavitt and those who think like her believe. Africa can be bullied into silence. Let her watch now as we rise louder than ever before. The words spread like wildfire. Clips shared across every platform, dubbed into countless languages. Even in Washington, staffers in Caroline's office could not avoid the sound of cheers and chants, filtering through their screens. The optics were undeniable. Traoré had turned the narrative, battlefield into his victory ground. Caroline's fury was volcanic. This is unacceptable, she told her closest aide, her voice trembling with restrained rage. If Washington cannot silence him, then I will. The aide hesitated. Madam Speaker, what are you proposing? Her eyes narrowed. Direct engagement. If he wants to confront the so-called order face-to-face, then let him face me. On our stage, in our capital. I'll drag him into the lion's den and expose him before the world. And so, the unthinkable invitation was drafted. A formal call for Ibrahim Traoré to appear before a special session of Congress, framed as a dialogue on democracy and governance. Few in Washington believed he would accept. But when the message reached Ouagadougou, Traoré's answer came swiftly, I will come. The announcement detonated like a bombshell. Media outlets scrambled for coverage. Analysts speculated endlessly. And security agencies braced for the unprecedented spectacle. The idea of an African leader who had openly defied. Western power now standing in the very heart of its political temple was almost surreal. When the day arrived, the US Capitol was encircled by barriers, its steps patrolled by a phalanx of security. Protesters gathered on both sides, some chanting in support of Traoré, others waving flags and accusing him of being a dictator. Helicopters thudded overhead. The world was watching. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was electric. Caroline Leavitt stood at the podium, composed but taut, her hand gripping the edge of the wood as though anchoring herself. Across from her, Ibrahim Traoré walked with unflinching calm, every eye tracking his steady steps. He did not bow, he did not smile. He stood tall, a soldier among politicians. The exchange began politely enough, words wrapped in diplomatic packaging. Caroline invoked shared values, global stability, responsibility. Traoré listened, his face a mask of steel. Then came his turn. He leaned forward, his voice unyielding. Madam Speaker, you speak of democracy while your corporations strip our resources. You speak of stability while your bombs turn our villages to dust. You speak of responsibility. But where is your responsibility when children die so that your lights can shine? The chamber erupted, gasps, shouts, the pounding of gavels. Cameras zoomed in on Caroline's face, her practiced composure cracking at the edges. She fired back, her voice rising, her words sharp. And where is your responsibility, Ibrahim? Where is your democracy? Where are your elections, your free press, your checks and balances? Do you think the world will ignore your authoritarianism, simply because you cloak it in anti-colonial slogans? The duel had begun, live before billions. Each word was a strike, each rebuttal a counterstrike. Caroline wielded accusations of tyranny. Traoré countered with histories of exploitation. She invoked human rights. He invoked the millions left hungry by IMF policies. Back and forth they went. The chamber no longer a hall of legislation but an arena of ideological combat. In the end, there was no handshake, no neat resolution. Caroline stood defiant, but shaken. Traoré stood resolute, his message unbroken. The world, watching, was left to decide whose truth rang louder. Outside, the protesters' chants mingled into a single roar that seemed to shake the marble steps of the Capitol itself. The clash between Caroline Leavitt and Ibrahim Traoré had not settled anything. It had ignited something. A battle not just of two figures, but of two worlds. One old, clinging to its power. One new, demanding to be heard. And the echoes of that battle would not fade. They would only grow louder.